Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's event. My name is Mark Scott. I'm Politico's chief tech correspondent, and you are watching Politico Live. Today, we're here to speak about how the US and Europe can find common ground on regulating big tech. We have a fantastic speaker lineup from both sides of the Atlantic to explore the best ways to bridge the ongoing transatlantic gap on digital. It's also pretty good timing because US and EU officials met yesterday for the inaugural meeting of the US-EU Trade and Tech Council in Pittsburgh. So hopefully we can get some good views on what happened yesterday. First things first, we have some housekeeping remarks, and the goal here is to make this as interactive as possible, or at least as possible a Zoom meeting can be. Thanks for everyone for joining us online through our 4 platforms. You can watch this event through the Politico event website, Twitter, Facebook, and last but not least, LinkedIn. And we want to make sure that you get involved as much as possible. So if you want to ping me a question or a comment, you can use the hashtag PoliticoBigTech and aim that at live Politico, and we'll get those questions answered as much as possible. If you're watching this event on the Politico website, there you can also ask questions via Slido. That's sli.do. The idea is if you can type in your questions there, but I would really ask, if possible, to put your name on those so we know where you're coming from. You can see me, you know my name, and you're going to know the name of the participants. So it only seems fair that we also know your name and where you're coming from. If you're not watching through the event website itself, you can download and use the Slido app. And if you're using that, use the hashtag PoliticoBigTech to ask your questions. Appreciate that's a lot to go through, but the event page has more detail. And if you're on those other platforms, download the Slido app and then use the hashtag PoliticoBigTech to get the ball rolling. And I see a lot of you guys are putting in questions already, so I really appreciate that. I also want to put a little poll that we will come back to at the end of the event, and also helps to get the discussion going. As I mentioned before, we've had the inaugural first meeting of the EU-US Trade and Tech Council yesterday in Pittsburgh. And so I'm asking you, as I'm about to ask the participants, what was the major takeaway from that first meeting? And you can find the suggestions and answers on Slido, and we'll come back to them at the end of the discussion. Now, back to our speakers and to the main event. We have a wonderful lineup, and so we're looking forward to getting into some of the details here. Should we start off with Vera Jourova, Vice President for Values and Transparency at the European Commission, Adam Cohen, Director of Economic Policy at Google, Karen Kornbluh, Senior Fellow and Director of the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and a former US Ambassador to the OECD. And last but not least, Tom Wheeler, a former Chairman of the US Federal Communications Commission, and now visiting fellow at both the Brookings Institute and a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. So with those details out of the way, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. It's wonderful to have you, and hopefully we can do this in person sometime very soon. Vice President, I want to turn to you first, purely because it would be remiss of me not to bring up the Trade and Tech Council, as that happened yesterday, and we have the statement on potential cooperation between the US and the EU, which is frankly why we're here to discuss this. What did you make of the conclusion? They seem to be focusing on things like AI, trade-focused issues like export controls and investment screening. Were you happy with how this turned out yesterday?
Hello, thank you for inviting me. First of all, I am happy that the council has been organized, and that the people met and that they discussed the key issues. Also, you mentioned trade and other things. I was really waiting for the outcomes for common work on the vis-a-vis the big tech and the digital space, because I see a lot of space here for common action and for cooperation, for maybe even the ambitious plan to set the global standards together with the United States. So I am happy it happened. I am quite glad that it is understood as a good start for continuing of the work.
Tom, maybe turn to you from the US side. We were discussing this before we came on air about sort of what was and was not said in the final statement. A lot, from my perspective, was about, okay, we're beginning, but this is the beginning of the process, not the end. What did you make of some of the statements coming out yesterday?
Well, I mean, first point, hooray, we are back thinking about a multilateral world again. That's a huge step forward. And the fact that everybody was sitting down and talking is incredibly important. I agree with you, Mark, that the effort that was put in place insofar as trade, AI, things like that are significant substantive steps forward. I didn't see substantive steps forward in the areas having to do with platform regulation, for instance. I mean, I've got a copy of it right here, and I was just looking at Working Group 5, where it says it's tasked to exchange information. We tend to exchange information. We also plan to engage in discussion. That's really important. We need to have those kind of exchanges. For the last 4 years, at least, we have refused to engage in that as a nation. However, I don't think that there are results beyond, well, let's meet again to talk about this that came out of Pittsburgh on that particular topic.
Karen, maybe a more basic question is, what's it for? It's about trade and tech. It's about EU and US relations. But, you know, if you talk to different parts of the Brussels sphere and in DC, it's either an anti-China thing, it's pro-Atlanticist, it's about, curbing big tech through regulation, it's about sharing ideas on trade. From your perspective, what's it supposed to be doing?
So as somebody who's worked on tech policy and trade policy for a long time, to me, this felt like a big change. Especially for the US. We had this Washington consensus that was really hands-off, really laissez-faire. So even when China abused the international trading rules through unfair competition, hiding spying capabilities inside products, human rights violations, the US was extremely hands-off. And then as big tech grew bigger and bigger, and was engaging in more and more outrageous practices, it was also similarly hands-off in the tech space. And so, I see Tom's point completely, but to me, to be coming here and saying that we're going to be talking about these platform accountability issues with Europe, and we're going to acknowledge that algorithmic amplification of illegal and harmful content is a problem, and that we're going to get researchers access to data, those feel like seismic changes to me. And I think the point of it is, we're not going to do it, this is to answer your question, Mark, we're not going to do it unilaterally. So Trump took some of that pent-up frustration and I think just started bashing things in almost a lawless way from the multilateral point of view. What they're coming together and saying is, there are ways of addressing this frustration within a multilateral rules-based system. And so they took pains to say, we're going to look at the investment screening with using the OECD framework. We're going to be cognizant of WTO rules. We're going to use regulatory mechanisms. So they're doing it in a way that says we can start to put together a vision and a framework for the world to move forward in a values-based way to address the problems that the US has identified with China and that the Europeans have identified with big tech.
Adam, I'd be, not to put you on the spot as sort of the representative from a so-called big tech company, but Google has skin in this fight in terms of platform regulation and some of the trade policies, and then separately around tax and competition. As someone who covers some of these areas, and someone and an American living in Europe, what did you make of this? Is it sort of, are we back on this multilateral approach? Is it the beginning of something? Is it a false dawn? Where do you see it?
I hope we're back. We have been very strongly supportive of multilateral cooperation on tax, on regulatory issues generally. This is the relationship between Europe and the United States is the most important economic relationship in the world. And I think it seems right for both sides to discuss digital issues, trade issues, and economic policy questions. I think there's a lot of room for close cooperation on those particular areas. I think there are a lot of I'm glad to see that there are a lot of shared goals. I do take Tom's point that this is the beginning of a discussion, but I think from a company perspective, we strongly encourage that discussion and some establishment of common ground.
Vice President, I just want to come back to what you said initially in terms of some of the platform regulation that you are working on. That right now is not part of this discussion, at least not in the initial or at least the initial meeting. It might come back in the spring. What would you like to see come from the second meeting? I mean, you are very focused around some of the misinformation issues, which I mentioned briefly in one of the working groups. What would you like to see come now as these working groups get going? And hopefully we'll get more sort of detail on the actual alignment. And then secondly, are you concerned, particularly with what happened to the semiconductor issue and it getting watered down, that TTC may fall again to the issue of geopolitics?
On semiconductors, I don't have details, so I will skip this one. On what I expect from the continuation in spring, well, I'm looking forward to it because we didn't have many serious discussions about the regulating of big tech from the point of view of combating disinformation or hate speech or illegal content. And I have to say, I received a lot of unpleasant lectures when I spoke to the representatives of President Trump's administration that in Europe we go in the direction of some kind of censorship, and a lot of lectures about the First Amendment of the American Constitution. And I tried to explain that we very much appreciate the role of the digital space and internet and those social platforms, even in, enabling communication, sometimes education and so on. But at the same time, we really don't want them to become the highways which will enable crime to travel and violence to be spread and worsen the situation in real life. So what I expect, I think that the EU is ahead of the US in the field of regulating the platforms. We have we've been running the code of conduct against hate speech. We have the code of practice against disinformation, which we are now upgrading. I think that these are good examples of which we might share with our US partners, how it works, how we would like this to work, because we are not fully satisfied with the results. Also, the Trade and Technology Council under the working group 5 has it clearly that there should be the cooperation on illegal and harmful content limitation, algorithmic amplification, working on more transparency and so on. So I think that the spring discussion could give us the opportunity to explain to US partners how it is meant on our side, where we want to go, what is the Digital Services Act role as the first hard regulation in this field, what we want to do on political advertising, because by the end of the year, I'd like to propose the legislation on this, stricter rules for political advertising than for commercial advertising. And also, I think that we should speak about, in general, how to guarantee that the digital space will respect the values which are shared between the US and EU. So more or less also philosophical question, how we can strengthen this aspect and how we can also push the rest of the world to follow suit.
Karen, just maybe on the back of that, you've done work around the misinformation space. Do you think there's a willingness and openness from DC to look at that? Maybe not through some sort of similar Digital Services Act legislation, because there are limits, but maybe through voluntary code of practice like we see in Brussels. I mean, what's the temperature like in Washington and the White House right now in terms of on those issues?
Yeah, I think it's warming up. I think there was an initial focus on antitrust. Obviously, there's been an executive order, personnel appointments that are very tough on the antitrust space. But I think there's been movement towards looking at the platforms, looking at disinformation, and also looking at AI, which is closely linked, of course, because of the algorithmic promotion of disinformation. So the FTC has laid down the gauntlet there, that they're going to take a look at that. I thought, so I think talking to Europe as Europe is considering the DSA and having a more productive conversation than what Vice President has talked about in terms of, lecturing, having a more productive conversation and looking at, while U.S. Congress is so slow to act, and even the DSA is going to take a long time, what can be done in the meantime? How could the U.S. perhaps piggyback on this code of practice, now code of conduct? How can Europe and the U.S. piggyback on some regulatory things like the FTC? And it was interesting to me what they, as Tom said, it was a vague statement on platform accountability, but they identified specific harms, which is new. And they mentioned using voluntary and multi-stakeholder initiatives, it says, to complement regulatory approaches, which could mean, we're going to keep with the self-regulatory model, but it could also mean, we're going to piggyback, we're going to have regulator teeth behind some of these multi-stakeholder initiatives, and we're going to push forward to see some results. And my sense is there's an appetite for that. When you saw President Biden, his Surgeon General come out and call disinformation about vaccines a public health crisis, and the president himself saying that social media disinformation kills, I think that has to translate at some point into some policies, obviously not content-based policies because of the concerns with free expression, but some, regulatory / multi-stakeholder activity.
Before we move on from the TTC, I do want to spend the whole time talking about it. Tom, I just want to ask you one final question on where this fits in more globally. So, just before the TTC meeting, the US held its separate Quad discussions with Japan, India, and Australia. Some of these things are interlinked. How much do you think, if this is a US administration looking at the Pacific and the Atlantic, how much of an overlap do you think, those different initiatives can have?
Well, overlap, yes, they have to relate to each other, if that's what you mean by overlap. But let me go to a point that's key here, Mark. And the reason we're having this discussion is because the interconnected world has created an environment where what happens in one country is relevant in another country. And that is going to manifest itself in these issues of expression as well. As the vice president said, there are different approaches in Europe to the freedom of expression than there is from the First Amendment in the United States. And yes, we need to have meaningful discussions about that. And yes, we need to be doing more, Madam Vice President, than lecturing. But the fact of the matter is that the GDPR demonstrated, for instance, that a decision that happens in a major market like Europe in an interconnected world has an impact in the United States, including on state laws in the United States. And we have to look at this entire topic in that kind of a context, that we are going to end up looking like or behaving in a way that where rules have been set elsewhere, and therefore the effort has to be to make sure that those rules may not be identical from country to country, but are at least consistent. And that's the challenge that we've got. Let's go through and talk about where are the consistencies and focus on that.
Gotcha. Talking of consistencies, Adam, as someone who has dealt with officials on both sides of the Atlantic, and we've discussed how maybe things have changed slightly since the Trump administration stepped down. Have you seen just from your discussions, a shift in tone or dynamic? We have 6 antitrust bills in the US right now. The Digital Markets Act is making its way through, Parliament in Brussels. I mean, is this rhetoric? Are you with your discussions with your colleagues, are you seeing a change in focus and emphasis in terms of the importance of these issues for both, the Europeans are always there, but for the American side, has that changed at all?
I think these issues have been emerging or coming to the fore for quite some time now. There's been an active discussion in both sides of the Atlantic, and I think it's reasonable to have, given the role technology is playing in our lives, what we've seen in the pandemic, the way that the technology helped people stay connected, continue to do business, and continue to function during this unbelievable period of economic shutdown. I think that these issues aren't necessarily as political as you described, Mark. I mean, I think what we see is that there's a burden on us. It's incumbent upon Google and other companies to have a fact-based conversation about how our businesses operate, how we build our products and services, the value that they can create, some of the concerns, addressing some of the concerns that arise in that context as well. I don't necessarily see that as an administration to administration or election to election type issue. It's something that we need to do consistently.
But it is fair to say that, there are several investigations ongoing into companies that didn't exist before Biden took over. That right? That is a shift that has happened.
I mean, from what I see, there was litigation initiated in the United States before this administration came in. I think that some of the same questions that we were asked in the Obama years, we were asked by subsequent officials. I see a much more consistent series of questions. And again, our role in this is to really just focus on how we operate and provide evidence and substance into that discussion.
Okay. The part of this conversation we're having is about common ground, and where both sides are democratic, relatively affable parts of the world. Vice President, when you look at the European side, you've got the Digital Service Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Governance Act, the European Democratic Action Plan, you've the AI Act. It goes on and on and on. In the US, you've got 6 antitrust bills, although no federal privacy rules right now. If you had a magic wand and could focus on an area of immediate, short-term cooperation on legislation, or at least, if not legislation, areas of common ground, where would you focus? You have a privacy and misinformation part of your remit, but where would you like to see that happen in the short term?
First of all, it was rather shocking, this long list of the things which we adopted or which are going to adopt on the European side, which we call sometimes in a poetic way that we try to form the European digital soul. And we want to say that, yes, there are the values we stand for, and we have to see fully respected also in the digital space. I often say that still the real life is better than what is mirroring in the digital space. So we should work on this. If I have the chance to predict, first of all, where I see the chance of having the key pillars of the legislation adopted on our side. For the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, I heard a lot of strong words and determination from the French presidency, which is in the first half of the next year, when I think that there will be very, very, very strong will to accomplish, to finalize the negotiations. And then there is a relatively short time for the implementation into practice. So we might see this functioning fully, so this legislation to be enforced already in 2023-24. And here I think that it could be one of the things where the US could get the inspiration. And what we had before, we do not expect copy-paste a solution, or we do not want to see identical solutions on American side, because of course we respect the regulatory autonomy and different traditions and way of thinking. but we would like to see the principles which we try to get to put into the legislation, the same principles being taken seriously on US side. The second thing, so it was the legislation which will introduce more transparency and more responsibility for the platforms. Here, I think that the US could move. The second thing, of course, I will not surprise you. I would like to see the federal legislation on data protection because it's not only an issue for us in the running negotiations on the new system for the data flows, but I think that for United States, it might be a growing issue, this fragmentation of rules. Already there is the law in California, in Virginia, in Colorado, maybe some others will follow. And I think that it should be a signal for the federal level that the fragmentation will not be beneficial for the business. And here again, the inspiration in Europe, by GDPR, we tried to introduce one continent, one law principle, not to fragment the digital single market. And I think that the same issue is something we see on the United States side. So these two things, maybe the third thing, the regulation on artificial intelligence, where we already adopted the rules, risk-based approach, I think very proportionate model. So these three things might be realistically seen as captured by the American administration.
Karen, just in response to that, so we're looking at maybe the Digital Services Act and Markets Act by 2023, a call for federal privacy law, as well as AI. I mean, I'm very skeptical about federal privacy law, as you know, but I mean, is there a chance, even in terms of some of the congressional legislative proposals, that they can make it through before the next US election, presidential election?
I mean, I hate to be pessimistic, and I'm, as I said, I'm quite pleased with what happened in Pittsburgh, and I see the glass is really half full there. When we start to talk about legislative proposals, I think the glass is really half empty, and we have to be pessimistic. I mean, we see what's going on this week, just in terms of getting budget agreements to keep the government up and running. So I don't see us coming to an agreement in this kind of divided, slow-moving Congress on privacy in the short term. I hate to say it, but that's where I think the regulatory and the multilateral and multi-stakeholder processes offer some benefits, because I think if we could get some transparency, some accountability, at least some design elements that made sense, again, not focusing on content, out of our regulators, and maybe even out of some multilateral mechanisms, could move the ball forward. That's why I like this idea that they're sort of hinting at in this statement about multi-stakeholder initiatives complementing regulatory approaches. I mean, that may be a way of getting some action while the legislative processes on both sides of the Atlantic take a really long time, building on the FTC's authorities, building on the code of practice, that maybe there's some hope there. I mean, and then I'm sure you're going to get to this, but we've got these whole other issues like tax to deal with that also require legislation.
Yeah, it's on the question list. It's going to focus on. Yep, go ahead, Tom.
Mark, can I just? I think Karen just made a really good point, and it appears to me as though the Biden administration has identified what Karen just said, which is the chances of legislation are slim. So let's really get aggressive in regulation. And I think we're going to see even more of that coming up, which means that the decisions will end up being made in courts. And so the real issue of what is United States policy going to be is going to end up being decided in a jurisprudential kind of a context. And that also will be a slow developing context. And so while we may be able to move out and come up with rules that address things that have been too long ignored, when those become final, and if they become final, is a decision will be made by people wearing robes.
Tom speaks from experience.
Can I just take a step back? Because one thing that I suppose it's very difficult not to talk about is the China and maybe the Russia, or enveloped in the authoritarian government regime component to this, right? Because as much as there are legitimate and long-standing differences between the US and Europe, we're also very similar in many ways. And by focusing on these narrow areas, is there not something we're missing more broadly? I mean, Vice President, I've talked before about sort of the Russia threats and disinformation within Europe. You look at sort of some of the cybersecurity threats that have played out in the US, as well as the ongoing China question in terms of what's going on maybe at the ITU election next year and other things. Are we not, by focusing on the small, missing the big? And that is, and I'll say this because I'm a political journalist, like the geopolitics of this, that we are facing a clash of minds, a clash of societies, a clash of ideology, And if Europe and the US can't find meaningful and long-term ways to work with each other, be it through regulation, be it through legislation, be it through the ties that bond, we are going to be sort of watching while a China comes up and set standards for the next for the emerging technologies. Maybe Vice President, what do you think to that concern?
Yes, I think that this is a very strong point, or a strong call for closer cooperation with the US, because I think that from the point of view of spreading misinformation, foreign interference, cyber attacks, we have the same adversaries, because we have evidence that these are coming from the same places. And you mentioned Russia and China, and we openly put those two countries as the most frequent producers of disinformation on European territory. And it's quite obvious that the digital tools and digital tools and systems in the hands of autocrats cannot be used for anything good for people, for their own people, but also for the people on the whole planet. So I think that here we should join forces. We are working on the new cybersecurity strategy, and we will adopt the new legislation, which will, of course, seek to make Europe better protected against these attacks from outside. And as for the foreign interference and disinformation attacks, I think there is a lot of space to cooperate with the United States on that. We are working with Joseph Borrell on a possibility to sanction those who are attacking European Union from outside, something similar which we are already doing against the perpetrators of the cyber attacks. So I think that here we have plenty of space for cooperation and joining forces with the United States, because this is the highest security call, and we face the same threats.
On that point, I just want to go to some of the questions we're getting in. Excuse me, I'm going to look at my other screen, so I'm not being rude. We have Callie Schroeder from Epic. The question reads, do you feel that collaboration between enforcement entities has kept pace with the increasingly borderless nature of data processing and tech development? And so I suppose the question, not to paraphrase, but sort of, the world's moved quickly. Do you think the existing regulation has kept pace?
Let me say no. I think the last time that a senior United States government official sat down to actually develop policy, not just talk about the need for policy, actually develop policy, was when I went to Europe after we passed the net neutrality rules and sat down with all my counterparts in the EU and helped as they developed their own net neutrality rules, not so that they would be identical, but so they would be compatible. And so I don't think that we have had any leader-to-leader kind of constructive activity for the last 4 years.
Yeah, and I just to underscore, I mean, it's great that we're moving finally towards some kind of common ground, but the technology is not standing still while our legislative and regulatory processes work themselves out, and we have these discussions. And China's not standing still, and Russia's not standing still. So, it's really unfortunate that we're so late to the game and that we're so slow moving, because, if we see disinformation now, if we see surveillance now, if we see, censorship, it's going to get worse and worse. And China and Russia are busy in the standard setting organizations and at the UN trying to really give themselves a lot more power to cut off access to the internet and control what happens on the internet and enable a lot more security incursions while we're thinking this all through.
Gotcha. This is a very odd segue, so forgive me, because I want to. There's a variety of topics I want to discuss. One of which is digital tax. I'm not sure how to segue from Russian cybersecurity threat. Adam, you've been involved from the Google side in this, and what I find interesting is we have a meeting coming up in a couple of weeks that hopefully will provide greater clarity on this global tax deal that will both include companies like yourself as well as sort of non-digital companies. What we did see, though, that the Biden administration early in the spring put forward some proposals that sort of, in my words, kind of undermine the the European perspective in terms of let's not just focus on digital, let's look at the whole economy. And they also asked the Commission to potentially postpone its separate digital levy, until we can get some sort of global deal done. You could argue that that is a way for consensus, that people take on views and change and alter it. One also could say that that is the US winning in a zero-sum world. With the tax talks coming up, where do you see it? Are we in a position now where, I presume Google would like to see not just itself, but other non-digital companies involved in this overhaul. But the fact that the Biden administration was able to get its way when, frankly, many countries like France did not want that, is that not an area of friction going forward?
There's a lot of complexity to that, Mark, but let me start from maybe a beginning standpoint, which is that the OECD was looking at how, in a globalized and interconnected world, multinational companies pay tax and where they pay tax. And they started looking at this question 2011, 2012, and asked whether or not the digital economy was somehow different than the rest of the economy. And after 2 years of study, they reached the conclusion that actually digital wasn't separate. The whole economy is digital or digitalizing. And the features that you see with large tech companies, where they pay the majority of their corporate income tax in their home market, is not dissimilar from other multinational companies. And so the OECD actually advised in its conclusions around the so-called base erosion and profit shifting report that was published in 2015, they actually advised a broader look than just the digital economy. And my understanding of the progress of the OECD talks and via the G7 and G20 is that there is agreement that there should be some reapportionment to countries where products and services are consumed of the corporate income tax that's currently paid in home markets. And that should be done, we're very supportive of this approach, it should be done in a coordinated way. Otherwise, you end up with a system where countries or jurisdictions are picking and choosing which taxpayers can pay more here, but the ones that tend to pay most of their tax in my country shouldn't be subject to these types of reapportionment rules. My understanding is that this agreement is progressing. It's complex. The complexity underpinning the international tax system is mind-boggling, but that countries are working together and getting closer to an agreement, and we strongly support that.
Karen, as a former US ambassador to the OECD, I'm going to maybe turn to you because this is an OECD process. Is it a Biden win or is it a win for multilateralism?
I should just say I haven't been working on this issue. I have so much trouble seeing how we're going to get this resolved because in the US, taxes are the third, fourth, and fifth rail. You know, any one senator is going to be able to block an agreement to increase taxes on their constituents or donors. And I just have, Senator Toomey has already said that he would block ratification. So I'm just having trouble seeing how we get this through. And then, European countries will act unilaterally. They'll be slapped with tariff. I mean, I just don't see how this resolves. I'm mystified, but I'm not working on it. So I'm hoping somebody way smarter than me has figured that out.
Thank you for that. Again, a wonderful segue now to data protection because we're whipping through these topics really quickly because there's so much to chat. I'm going to maybe reframe a question I had for the Vice President through a question that we're getting from someone called S.R. Dane. Forgive me if I'm saying that incorrectly. The question reads, is there a route between data security, surveillance, and privacy with the EU and the US? And I think the individual is referring to the ongoing data transfer privacy shield talks. So is there a way for Europe to uphold its fundamental rights of privacy while also allowing the Americans to also have their legitimate right for national security in those talks?
Yes, you are asking somebody who still feels some pain after the privacy shield has been suspended by the European Court of Justice. So as such, I tell you, yes, there is a way, but we need more time. We need more maybe proactive approach or proactive approach. I would like to say that this administration is very proactive in offering us some new ways, some creative ways how to guarantee more protection on US side. We still need more time, or several months maybe, to finalize the negotiations. And the American friends and partners cannot be surprised because on EU side, we now have very rich and strong jurisprudence given by the European Court of Justice, which sets very clearly the criteria for the protection of privacy, which has to travel with the data. And so that's why we will be very cautious and very precise in the way how these criteria should be applied and projected into the new possible system, which will enable the data flows under the new regime. So I am quite positive because I know that the negotiations are very, very intensive. And I spoke to Gina Raimondo. I think she's doing an amazing job because as the Commerce Secretary, she is also engaging and helping the talks on the side of national security, where we have the issues, because this is about the surveillance of data by the state agencies. And I, according to what my colleagues tell me, that they are moving towards some possible deal. But believe me, on European side, there will be a lot of caution, and we will not be able to sign something which will not guarantee that we will not one day see any new, let's say, Schrems 3 case at the European Court of Justice, which might suspend this new system.
Just to follow up on that before I get some comment from others, from your perspective, would you accept, I appreciate there were negotiators doing this, but from your perspective, would you accept a deal that didn't involve changes to US legislation? Is there a way to get this done through an executive order instead?
How I see it, it's not a conditio sine qua non to see the federal law. I always said that it would help a lot, and that not having such law on American side, it makes the deal very difficult, and it really requires a lot of measures and safeguards on American side to guarantee similar adequate protection, or is essentially equivalent protection, because this is exactly what the court wants us to have guaranteed on American side. So with these measures which we are working on, we will have to fill in this gap while having the no federal law. So we have to live with it. We have to work with the realities on the American side. But that's why I said before that I would really like the U.S. To move in the direction of the bipartisan federal legislation.
Tom, just to come back to you, because I think I wrote down, I want to come back to it. I think someone from viewers mentioned it too, which I think is important. It's not about uniformity, it's about compatibility, right? And this doesn't just apply to privacy, it looks at competition. You could apply it to maybe content moderation across the board. What is there a common denominator in this, and not just on the privacy front, right? Because it feels that, if the Europeans and Americans can't do a deal to share people's personal information, and they are the closest of allies, what do we do about, sending data to China or to Brazil or to other places? Is it a question of, giving to get? I mean, how do you get that compatibility? And do you do that through multilateralism or bilateralism?
Well, you got to start with the cautious optimism that the vice president expressed, because we've done it before. The privacy shield was in place until the ECJ did their thing, but we've proven that there are ways that we can resolve this collectively. I think there was also a glimmer of hope yesterday in the Senate Commerce Committee hearings on privacy legislation, in which it appeared as though both sides were now talking about an individual right of action, which has been a stumbling block to any legislation. The state preemption issue is still an issue, but I mean, I got to tell you, I'm stunned at the breakthrough on individual right of action, and quite encouraged by that. Doesn't mean that you're going to get legislation tomorrow or the next week, but it does open the door. And as I say, it is a ray of sunshine. I keep going back to this compatibility question, and the EU itself. One of the things I learned when we were negotiating the net neutrality issue is the EU itself is a great example of saying we can have a common underpinning that still allows for unique national sovereignty. It's not easy to find that. It's not easy to work that out with all the players, but it is possible to find commonly applied concepts and then to have the agility to apply them in specific circumstances to reflect sovereignty. One quick historical note. I'm a frustrated historian, and it was 1865. And when the telegraph was new, and the French government pulled together all the European governments that were running telegraphs, and came up with a common set of practices and rules that it was then the International Telegraph Union. It evolved eventually into the EU and to the International Telecommunication Union. But this is something that we have been struggling with since the beginning of the communications revolution, and have been able to deal with. So I'm cautiously optimistic that people of good faith can find common agreed to concepts that allow for local agility.
Adam, as someone representing the industry, I presume that's also something you would call for, right? I mean, no one is asking for some sort of global regulatory norm, but Google, Facebook, Amazon, and smaller companies, they also going to benefit if, things as in the current situation with Privacy Shield don't really work, right? I mean, that's something I presume industry would also back.
I think any company, large or small, would encourage sort of more regulatory harmonization. I think the idea that everything looks the same around the world is elusive. It wouldn't be a reasonable expectation. But I'm encouraged, and I think we would strongly support major trading and economic partners like the EU and the US to keep working together on these types of things. I think that the TTC is a good starting point, and there's lots to discuss. There's room for cooperation and I think common standards on cybersecurity, on disinformation and misinformation. I think that there's a lot of room for common ground there. I would strongly encourage it.
Karen, I will be the cynic because that's what I'm paid to do. And I look at Congress right now, and I look at the reconciliation around the budget, and I look at the polarization, and I look at the priority that digital gets compared to COVID and economic recovery. And I then look at hear Tom talk about, we just need compatibility, not uniformity. But from the US side, the Vice President has laid out what the Europeans are going to be doing over the next 18 months. And I look at the US side and go, well, compatibility only works when you have something to compare to. And how much movement will we get? Let's leave the regulation aside and focus on legislation. How much movement do you think we'll get on digital between now and say presidential election?
I'm a cynic when it comes to Congress as well. I think it's always been the better bet to bet against legislation moving. And that's especially true right now when it's so divided and when folks really don't seem to want to get a lot done, especially when there are business interests that would benefit from something not getting done, just very frankly. The one area where I think I disagree with you, Mark, is on Privacy Shield, because there's so much business interest in getting it done. There's so much political interest on both sides of the Atlantic. So I can't believe that we're not going to get something done on Privacy Shield. We just heard some flexibility on the part of the Vice President about whether or not we need legislation. I agree with you and what you've written, that the intelligence community isn't going to give up a lot, and there's not a lot of leverage when it comes to them. But I can't believe that something won't be figured out to get that through, just because there is such uniform business momentum behind getting it done. But then I think the interesting challenge on that one is, where do we go from there? We passed the Cloud Act that talks about sort of a more global kind of Privacy Shield, if you will. And only the UK has qualified. So what are the rules going to be for data transfer more globally when we see all this data localization happening? And so I think that'll be really interesting. But your main point about all these other issues, very pessimistic about any legislation. And as I said before, the technology's not stopping, China's not stopping, Russia's not stopping. So it's a real quandary.
I defer to the Vice President, who knows this topic better than I do. I've been looking at Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield since 2014, and I feel the CJU is going to have something to say about whatever decision comes. But that's a personal view, nothing else. I'm conscious we have about 5 minutes left, and we've gone deep in a lot of topics. One topic we haven't gone on is COVID. Weirdly, strangely, after the last 18, 19 months we've had. I would be interested to know, and not to mix too much things here, but what has COVID done in terms of digital regulation and policy? Because you look at, we're doing this via Zoom. Most of us haven't been able to get on a plane for a long time. It has shown both the importance and potential downsides to technology. And I just would be interested, it feels weird not to talk about COVID, as it's still going on. And Vice President, maybe to you first, we look at anti-vax misinformation. We look at the ability to people to connect through social media platforms, that it's not one thing or the other. I just would like to maybe get your thoughts on, what has the last 18, 19 months taught us about tech, digital, when we've been going through all of this?
Yeah, because we are true believers that digitalization is a good thing, needed. We had a medium-term plan for digitalization, which was accomplished in 1 year because we did this jump forward, and the people went digital because they didn't have any other choice, and the economy and the way we do things in Europe. So it was a very quick step forward, which we want to take now and continue and invest in it, because we spoke about the regulation, but in Europe we really want to invest in technologies, in the public investments, in people, in skills. So this is not only about regulation, and also on this field of investments and development of technologies, I see a lot of space for cooperation with US. On COVID, it was last year spring when we agreed with the big tech that they will remove the disinformation which will be proven as dangerous for health and lives. And it was exceptional measure we wanted them to take in exceptional time. Otherwise, we do not speak about removing content because we want to keep the space with the primary principle of freedom of speech. But in COVID time, we pushed the big tech. They cooperate till now. There are millions of takedowns. I think that it is quite visible that they try to do what they promised or they committed. But in my view, there should be more done now. So we will discuss it again.
Tom, just turn to you. Again, I appreciate we have a few minutes. So I'm going to keep this very brief. Again, thoughts on the COVID question and how that's affected how we look at this.
So I think that, the vice president has just spoken to the content side of things. Let me talk about the conduit side of things. That in this country, I think what COVID has done is to drive home the importance of high-speed broadband connections. And hopefully we're going to get the infrastructure bill voted on and passed. $62 billion, $42 billion for building to the unserved homes and businesses in America, and $20 billion for connecting those who have economic challenges getting on the internet. And we have, after years of talking about the digital divide, we are finally stepping up and doing something about it. And the reason why, I believe, is because everybody saw how crucial access to high-speed internet is during the pandemic.
Thank you. I promised my colleagues I would keep this to time. So Karen and Adam, I'm really sorry I have to just cut it a little bit short. I just want to say, just wrapping up, and I'm going to, in typical journalistic fashion, steal from someone else, Tom's point about compatibility, not uniformity. I think it's really a good way of looking at this. As someone who is both an American and a European, I live this myself, but I think the idea of we don't need to into the rules to have the same set of principles. So I think that's a good way to finish this conversation. Before we go, I just want to say thank you so much to all the speakers who took the time, as well as the audience. Just to let you know, the question we asked at the beginning was, let me bring it up here, excuse me. What was the major takeaway from the EU-US Trade and Tech Council? And by a vast majority, the winner was transatlantic commitments to work more closely together. I give kudos to the 4% of people who, the 21% of people who said, what is the Trade and Tech Council? That's good to see that we're breaking through. So again, thank you so much for participating. And final thing is, if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it from you. Hopefully all positive. Please send it to live@politico.eu. And with that, thank you so much to the speakers, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.